Hi everybody and welcome to Pika Book. Today I'm going to be talking about a novel called Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, who's a Nobel Prize winning author of books such as Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, both very profound works that provide fantastic insights into the human condition, have amazing protagonists, really fantastic to read. He has a beautiful, very lyrical style which is quite easy to read. It's not very complex language, although of course the subjects that he takes up are extremely profound. So I find that combination quite appealing to read because you can enjoy a book without kind of getting caught up in the complexities of the structure and so on. And it's really about the story and the characters, and that's what I love about him as an author. Let's get into the story of this book, and then we'll talk about a little bit about the book itself and also compare it to some of his other works, and just do sundry conversation about the book, which is really what this channel is about. It's not a review, it's not a critique. I think these authors are so phenomenal that you'd be richer for the experience in terms of reading any of their books. So anyway, about the story, this is really about an artificial intelligence robot called Klara, and that's really Klara and the Sun is really based on her, the protagonist, and we see that the novel is essentially written through her eyes. She's an artificial intelligence robot that's based, the book opens with the characters being based in a shop window, essentially, in a storefront. And we learn that these AI bots, so Klara and one of her friends is kind of they're both standing in the shop window waiting to be sold. And there are other things happening in their surroundings, obviously. So Klara is learning about the world by looking outside the window and figuring out the movement of the sun. By the way, they're solar powered, so I think that's why Klara and the Sun is kind of the title of the book. And they draw their strength from the sun, so they're solar powered robots. And they see the sun as very virtuous, as something that you look towards in terms of happiness or in terms of joy, because that's really giving you the energy to be alive in their sense. And there's a storefront, so there's a store, there's a manager within that store, and Clara's looking out and learning about the world. They're supposed to behave appropriately when customers walk into the store and so on. So it's really set in that kind of in that context, and that's really where the novel begins. But essentially, these robots, particularly, there's things happening around them, by the way, where other robots, which are advanced models, are coming in and they have to be sold. So there's some kind of urgency, there's some kind of concern about them going unsold, and they have to behave appropriately before customers so that they can get picked. So there's a sense of like almost you feel like you're at an orphanage and you're looking at children kind of waiting to be adopted and being at their best so that they can be picked by these new parents that walk in. But the thing is that these robots are actually meant as companions for children. And they're supposed to be matched to these children for life and essentially kind of look after them. So there's clearly going to be a kind of motherly concern for these kids at some level. They have to be their best friends and kind of look after these kids. So there's a very interesting human dimension that immediately comes into the book. And just like the author does in various works and other works, it's seen through the perspective of this one protagonist. And as the reader, you kind of see the context, and obviously different things. You kind of know of the right and wrong, the context within which this character is placed, but the character themselves are ignorant. And so that's what leads to a lot of the tragedy, that's what leads to a lot of the meaning, a lot of the I think the beauty of the story comes out through that. So that's there in this book as well. Anyway, Klara finally finds her girl, who's named Josie, and it's very clear at the outset that Josie isn't very well, and Klara is supposed to take care of her. And Josie is not well because she's undergone some kind of procedure so that she can, in the future, this is set in the future, all children are enhanced, either genetically or in some other way, but it involves some kind of procedure, and that has made Josie ill. So there is some concern about the fact, whether she'll make it through or not. But that's a choice that the mother has to kind of live with, because she's made the choice of enhancing Josie. And there's obviously concern around her choice, whether it will result in Josie kind of finally losing a life in the attempt to uplift her into a genetically or, an enhanced person. There is a love interest for Josie, who's a young boy whose mother has decided not to get him enhanced, and so there is he's kind of a misfit in society, and the other children kind of tend to see him very differently. And so we see one side of being the risk of getting enhanced, and we see the risk of kind of getting left behind by society. So that plays out in front of us. So that's really what the book is about, and there's other factors in there, obviously. That already I've given away too many spoilers, but the story kind of plays itself out. There's the father figure kind of comes in towards the end. There's like different other things that happen, but really this story is about Klara as this intelligent robot, kind of seeing things from a fresh perspective, almost a childlike innocence, and being genuine to her feelings and her purpose that she's built for. She's built to be a friend to a young child, and that's kind of the destiny she's trying to fulfill. So there's no confusion in her mind about she's ready to make any sacrifice, because that's really her purpose for being here. And that's kind of, I find that very similar to the theme in Remains of the Day, where you look at the butler and he's putting aside his human interests, or his human kind of aspirations or desires aside, including his love, including his regard for his father. His father's falling sick, but he's still doing his butlering duties. So that's kind of what we see through the perspective of the main protagonist. And here it happens to be an artificial intelligence based robot. Now, and the story is very beautifully written. I mean, I must talk about how lyrically it's Kazuo Ishiguro, right? So it's going to be fantastic in terms of how he's written the book. There's obviously it's very enjoyable. There's huge amounts of fantastic material there. It's like I said, it's got that sense of tragedy. It's got deep insights into what it means to be human, particularly because you're looking at a robot and you're kind of figuring out how the humans behave towards her because she's a robot, whether they see her as real life or not, because ultimately what is life? Is it intelligence? Is it the physical flesh and bones? And so we kind of deal with all these questions. Some of them obviously you read between the lines and it's not there in the text, but the story itself is quite engaging, very nicely told. But I think this work doesn't quite rise to the levels that Remains of the Day did. And the reason I say that is because although there are fantastic themes in here, it's kind of not really set in a realistic universe at some level. Now that itself is not a concern, but especially when you look at something like Remains of the Day, you're aware that something did transpire. There was a class struggle. There were people who put their duties. They had to put their duties because of the class system, because of, in other parts of the world, you kind of reflect on it and you look at the caste system, or you might look at oppression and you might look at slavery that was enforced. And you look at, obviously, you kind of realize that there are protagonists in this world who had to undergo fairly tragic circumstances because the world believed in a certain value system, and that has already transpired. So because of that fact, I think Remains of the Day became much more tragic than something that's set in the future, which is representative of some of this oppression or some of these questions that we deal with in terms of what it means to be human and happiness and so on and so forth. But it's really, to me, it doesn't kind of rise to the same levels because of that. I mean, it doesn't have to be that you set it in a realistic kind of place. Books can have profound meaning even if they're completely in an imaginary universe. If you look at Harry Potter and the fight against evil, it doesn't have to be kind of realistic. It doesn't have to be a story that's set in the real world. But there are certain other things which I feel this book doesn't do quite as well as Ishiguro's earlier work, and particularly in terms of some of the storylines that interweave through this kind of seem a little bit contrived in terms of how they end up and what happens. But really, if you're talking about the journey of Klara herself, it's a fairly beautiful lyrical journey, and that has profound meaning right at the end. So I'm not suggesting that this is not a profound book or it's not a beautifully written book, but somewhere I did feel that the journey doesn't feel quite as real. I'm struggling to say this, but it doesn't quite ring true. I mean, essentially, I would look at some Ray Bradbury stories, for example, and you would find that they're deeply tragic. I think of one short story called The Foghorn, where there's a monster that looks at a lighthouse and kind of imagines that to be their soulmate. And there's a huge amount of tragedy in that story, despite the fact that it's completely imaginary. It's got no real characters, and you're looking at essentially a lighthouse, and a monster falling in love with a lighthouse. And still, there is a certain element, a deep understanding of loneliness, of true love, of not being able to find your soulmate within this world, right? That theme is very, very clear. Here, the theme seems to get a little bit muddled. You're not really sure whether this is about a class, about oppression, whether it's about artificial intelligence and what it means to be human. Is that something we're confronting right now? Is it about that, or is it about, certain other relationships that form around this central person? So, for example, I think one of the most profound things in this book is really about is the relationship between the manager of the store and Klara, because there's almost, and it's just true to Ishiguro's style, there is so much between the lines in the text that's unsaid, and that's really the beauty, because he writes very minimally and minimalistically. He writes very minimalistically, but he puts so much meaning into those lines that there's pages and pages of meanings in one paragraph, and that's really his best. That's when he's at his best. And I find that relationship between the manager and Klara, and when the manager kind of meets Klara right at the end and recognizes the true intelligence of this artificial intelligence-based robot, she almost is like a motherly figure to Klara. I think the tragedy of the manager not being able to fulfill their relationship with Klara as their daughter, and the tragedy of Klara being left behind once their purpose is done, and then kind of the world moving on, or Josie, for example, moving on in her life, not with a sense of malice, of course, or not even with a sense of neglect, but just as the natural progression of things. As things are temporary, things are ephemeral, and that's really part of Ishiguro's work. It's like you feel the tragedy of life, you feel the transience of life, the beauty in the relationships, but they're always unfulfilled, right? The love is never going to be consummated, the love is never going to be fulfilled. It's always something that's unsaid. It's always between the lines. That's really the beauty of his work. So from that perspective, this is fantastic. I just feel that it doesn't quite meet the standards of his earlier work. But to conclude, even his worst work would probably be a lot better than the best works of many authors. So it's really an enjoyable book, but keep an open mind. If you've read Ishiguro before, you might feel a slight twinge of it's not quite there. It hasn't quite become the great work. Of course, the themes there are contemporary. You're talking about things like AI. We're all concerned with all of that. And there's a certain amount of romanticizing of that notion. But it's contemporary. It's really enjoyable. You definitely enjoy it on a Sunday evening. Like I said, have a cup of tea, read this book. It will be fantastic. But if you're a true fan, you might find yourself feeling that slight twinge, saying, it's not quite a major work like his other work. And that's really the only thing I have to say about the book. But otherwise, really fantastic, really enjoyable. I hope that there's other works that explore some of these themes about being human, about what it means to be human, what interactions might be when things start talking to us intelligently, and how do we treat these forms of life, and so on and so forth. It's a great book, but leaves a little to be desired. So that's my summary, but only in context with the greatness of the author to be kept in mind. Otherwise, independently, just a great book to read. Let me know what you thought about this review. Put your comments in the comments box below. Do subscribe and like this video. Do subscribe to the channel. And I hope to see you again back here soon with some other reviews. And let's start a conversation about books. Please do suggest which are the books you'd like me to review, and I'll try and get around to them. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.